Hey everyone, welcome to today's video. I wanted to go ahead and just swatch a bunch of different supplies in my Sterling Ink Common Planner. I thought that this would be a good thing to do just because I am very new to the paper that's inside of this. I believe it's called Tomoe River paper. So it's quite a thin paper. It's about like 52 GSM, and I personally don't have very much experience with thin paper like this. In the past, then I became very familiar with the thick 160 GSM paper that's often found in like Archer and Olive and Notebook Therapy journals. So I thought that I would just go ahead and swatch a lot of the different supplies that I would possibly find myself using throughout the year to either decorate or write things into this journal, and basically just take a look at how they perform, if there is any ghosting, any feathering, or any bleed through. So I will be testing just kind of a random assortment of items from my collection. If there is a specific pen that you want me to do more of like an in-depth review on in my Common Planner and see like more shades in the line, then please let me know. I would love to do that for you in a future video, but without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right in. So I'm just going to flip over to a blank page here in the back. If you're unfamiliar with the Sterling Ink Common Planners, then the majority of this planner is actually just a lot of these blank pages in the back that has this grid ruling, and you can basically just use it to do whatever you like with, whether it be like journal entries like how I've been using it, or just additional planning or daily logging. So I'm just going to use the next blank page in my journal. I know that typically for pen tests, then people usually like to go all the way to the back of the journal. That way it's not kind of like just lumped in with everything else. However, I wanted to go ahead and just use it on the next page just because that would be the majority of how I use these pens, would be like in the middle of the book rather than have it be like at the very beginning or the very end. And that way it'll just give me a better idea of how it impacts the surrounding pages. So if I were to write with a pen and it ended up creating kind of like the texture on the other side, then I want to see how that affects the page underneath it. If there's any bleed through, then I would also like to see how that affects the pages behind it as well, etc. So let's go ahead and jump right in. I'd say that the first set of items would likely be the ones that I would find myself using in this journal most often. Alright, so now that I've zoomed you in a little bit closer, then I'm just going to take my Tombow Monograph mechanical pencil. This is the only mechanical pencil that I carry around in my pencil bag, and I wouldn't necessarily say that I do a lot of like journaling in pencil, but if I were to sketch something out in my journal, then I would likely do it with this pencil. So let's go ahead and just test this out. I don't think I mentioned this earlier, but I will also be doing a smear test, so I think that that will be very beneficial, especially since I typically prefer to use gel pens in my journals, so that would be very interesting to see how easily the gel pens smear. Alright, so what I did was I just wrote out 1 second and then I immediately smudged my finger over it just to see the smudging or the smearing immediately after writing, how that would look. And then I also did the same thing for 5 seconds. I waited 5 seconds and then I ran my finger over it to see the smudge, and then the same thing for 10 seconds. So as you can see, that the pencil actually held up very well immediately after writing. There's just the slightest bit of smudging, and then it was basically non-existent for 5 seconds and 10 seconds. So that is very good to see. I was just under the assumption that this was going to smear just because I found that in the past then graphite would typically smear easily. So that was a very pleasant surprise to see that it did not smear terribly. Alright, so as some of you may have seen in the last video that I posted about my first week in the Common Planner, then you will know that for the majority of the things that I wrote down in my journal, then I was using the Uniball Signo DX in the 0.28mm size. This is my preferred pen to use just because the nib is extremely fine, and I found that it just made writing a lot easier in the vertical weekly spreads. So this, I would say, would be my most used item so far in this journal. Alright, so again, that is a very pleasant surprise to see that there is just a little bit of smearing immediately after writing. However, with the 5 and 10 seconds, then it's virtually no smearing. So that is very great to see, especially, like I said, this is my preferred gel pen to use. I just love how dark it appears on the page, and it creates very thin lines, so perfect for writing in smaller areas. So that is a very nice result from that. Of course, the smearing may vary depending on what you have on your hands. Like if your hands are a little sweaty from writing, then I'm sure the sweat would probably cause it to smear a little easier, or if you have like lotion on or something like that, compared to when your hands are like just very dry, then that can also affect the results as well. So just something to keep in mind. Alright, so to continue on with gel pens, then another one of my favorites would actually be this Pilot G2 gel pen in the 0.38. So it's just slightly thicker than the Uniball Signo, and that's why I prefer the Signo, is because it is a little bit thinner than the Pilot one. But I do really love this gel pen as well. So let's go ahead and try this out. I actually don't think that I've even tried this one out yet in this journal, so I'm very curious to see how it performs. Alright, so this is interesting to see. I believe that it may be due to the fact that the Pilot is just ever so slightly thicker, and therefore it creates thicker lines, and so because there's more ink on the page, then it's more so prone to being smeared like this. So as you can see, it did end up smearing each of these times. The worst was obviously the 1 second or immediately after. But as you can see, it does get a little bit better with 5 seconds and then even better with 10, but there is still just a little bit of smearing after 10 seconds yet. So if you were to use the Pilot G2 on this page, then you would want to just keep in mind that you would have to wait a little bit longer to make sure that the ink has fully dried. And then moving on to a more recent favorite that I've discovered would be this Uniball One gel pen, and this is the 0.38 size as well, and it's just in the black shade. So I found that this ink is incredibly dark, so I'm very curious to see how this performs with the smudge test. And after I've swatched everything, then I will go ahead and share the other side just to take a look at like the ghosting as well as any bleed through. Alright, so that one is actually pretty impressive. I'm very happy to see the results from this one. As you can see, it definitely performed better than the Pilot G2 one. After 1 second, then you can see there is just a little bit of smudging, but after 5 and 10 seconds, then there is basically no smudging, which is very impressive, especially with how dark and pigmented this ink is. So that is a very pleasant surprise. Alright, so I'm going to do another gel pen here. This is just one of the Zebra Sarasa vintage gel pens. I will only be swatching out this, I believe it's the Camel yellow shade. Okay, so now that that has been swatched out, as you can see, then there is quite a bit of smudging with that one immediately after. With 5 seconds, there is still a little bit of smudging, but as you can see, not as bad. And then with 10 seconds, it may be a little bit hard to see on camera, but there's just the slightest bit of smudge right after the C there, but it's hardly noticeable. So again, that is definitely one that you would want to just wait a little bit longer to allow it to dry completely. Alright, so the next pen that I would like to swatch is actually very popular and very loved within the common planner and Hobonichi community, especially on this Tomoe river paper, would be the Jetstream ballpoint pen. So I'm typically not a huge fan of ballpoint pens, but I've had very good experience with this pen so far, and it writes very smoothly, similar to a gel pen, which is one of the reasons why I do really like it. Alright, Alright, so this does not surprise me at all actually. This is one of the reasons why people love this ballpoint pen so much, is because of how quickly it dries. So as you can see, there is absolutely no smudging on any of the levels. So that's very impressive and perfect for those of you who write very fast, or if you are left-handed, then this would be a great option for you because it just doesn't appear to smudge very easily. So that is great. So the next pen that I would like to swatch would be one of the Sakura Pigma Microns. I'm just going to do the 02 size. I know that there are several different sizes in this line. However, I thought that the 02 size would be just a nice middle ground average size in between all of the different sizes that they offer. Alright, so as you can see, there definitely is smearing immediately after being written with. There is just the slightest bit of smearing after 5 seconds as well as 10. However, I would say that it's quite subtle, so that is a good sign. But going back to something that I mentioned earlier, depending on what size you use, I'm assuming that the thinner the size, then perhaps it'll dry a little bit quicker, and the bigger the size, then it would take longer to dry. So just again, something to keep in mind if you are using different sizes in your journal. So this one is going to be kind of a weird one to test, but I also wanted to test out the Uniball Signo white gel pen. And it's not that I would technically journal with this or write with this. However, sometimes if I am writing and if I make like the tiniest little mistake, like if I spell a letter wrong and I don't want to pull out like my correction tape, then sometimes I just like to take my white gel pen and cover it up and then just rewrite on top of it or just leave it as is. So I want to go ahead and just test this out and see how it looks on this type of paper, if it kind of just blends in seamlessly or if the paper has more of a tint to it than what meets the eye. For this one, I'm just going to try coloring in a box and see if that can help make it a little bit more distinguishable off the page. Alright, so the smear test is likely very difficult to see, but just to show you on my fingers, then I did swatch it using 3 different fingers. So the middle finger here, then that was the immediate swatch, and then the ring finger was the 5 seconds, and then the index finger here was the 10 seconds. So as you can see, there is going to be some smearing, but I'm not surprised about that just because this pen is quite juicy and typically I would have to wait a while for it to dry down anyway before going on top of it to correct a letter or to turn the page. So I'm not sure how well you can see on camera, but I do see where I drew the box, and fortunately it's not as noticeable as I thought it was going to be. So I think that that is a good sign, especially when I need to make any tiny little corrections. Alright, so moving on to fountain pens, then I do only have 2 fountain pens. The first one that I will swatch is this Pilot Metropolitan. I do have 2 different ink cartridges. I have a black one and the brown one, but currently I have the brown ink that's in here. It's just from the same brand, Pilot. It comes in boxes like this. So let's go ahead and try this out. This one I have in the fine nib, so it should produce relatively thin lines. Alright, so as you can see, the ink did end up smearing. It was quite bad immediately after writing. It was still noticeable after 5 seconds, and there is just the slightest bit of smudging after 10 seconds. So definitely something to note if you are using specifically this brown ink. It doesn't matter what body fountain pen you use, but specifically with this brown ink, I personally didn't notice any scratchiness or any roughness while writing. Like, it didn't feel like I was just scratching the page with the nib by any means. So that's definitely something that I wanted to note with my experience using the fountain pen on this paper so far. And then the other fountain pen that I would like to try out is the TWSBI ECO fountain pen, and then it currently has, I believe it's the Diamine Ox Blood ink inside. And I can't recall if this was the fine nib or extra fine, but it's just one of the thinner nibs as well. So let's go ahead and test that out. Alright, so there you have it for the TWSBI ECO with the Diamine Oxblood ink inside. Unfortunately, as you can see, then it smeared pretty badly at all 3 stages. So this is definitely something that you would have to wait quite a while for it to completely dry before you move around the page or flip it over. The next couple of items that I would like to swatch out would be a few brush pens. So this first one will be the Tombow Fudenosuke brush pen in the hard tip. I have used this a couple of times just to write some headers, and I haven't had any issues with it, but let's go ahead and test the smudging with it. Alright, so as you can see, immediately after then there was just a little bit of smearing, but I would say that for the 5 and 10 seconds then it does look pretty good. So fortunately then you won't have to wait too long for the Tombow Fudenosuke hard tip to dry. The next brush pen that I would like to swatch is this ZIG Cocoiro brush letter pen. So I wanted to test this one out just because it is very small, smaller and finer than the Tombow Fudenosuke, and so sometimes I do like using this one to write just very tiny little headings. Alright, so for the ZIG, then as you can see, the smearing is pretty bad for this one as well. The immediately after and 5 seconds smeared pretty terribly, but then after 10 seconds, there is still a little bit of smudging, but it does look significantly better. So definitely another one that you would have to wait on, especially if you are using it to write headers or possibly even journal with. Alright, so now I'm just going to test out a Tombow Dual brush pen. This is just in the 772 shade. I have to say I haven't really used too many Tombows directly on the page in my planner yet. I've more so just been using them to color in stickers and then paste them in, so this will be very interesting to see. Alright, so that one performed pretty well actually. I do see just the slightest bit of smudging after the 1 second here, but for the 5 and 10 then I'd say that they look very good. So I have to say that is a very pleasant surprise. Alright, so moving on then, I'd say the remainder of these items then I haven't really found myself reaching for yet to use in my planner, but they're something that I could see myself potentially trying to use at a later time in my planner, so just something that I figured I would go ahead and just test them out now and include as part of this video. So the first one being another brush pen. This is one of the Sailor Shikiori brush pens in the pine color, so this nice foresty green shade. Oh yeah, and this is something that I should have done with the Tombow, and I'll actually come back to that in a second here, but I also want to test out the fine side of the double-ended pens that I use, just to see if that makes any difference. But before I go back to the Tombow then, I'd say that the Sailor Shikiori performed pretty well. Again, just immediately after then there is a little bit of smudging for both of them. For the 5 seconds, the brush pen does have a little bit of smearing just right after it. However, I don't notice that to be an issue with the fine side. And then the 10 seconds for both, then they both performed very well. Alright, so just to quickly go back to the Tombow. Sorry that it's going to be out of order now, but that is okay. Alright, so going back to the fine point on the Tombow, then the 1 second, then there is just a little bit of smudging after it, but the 5 and 10 seconds, then they look perfectly fine. So very similar, I'd say, to the brush pen. So that is great news. Alright, so now I'm going to try another brush pen. This is the Pentel Fude Touch brush pen. This is just in the black shade. Okay, so immediately after then there is quite a bit of smudging. I'd say that there is just the slightest bit of smudging for both 5 seconds and 10 seconds, but they are both pretty minimal, so that is a good sign. Alright, so I do have another gel pen that I would like to test out. This is specifically the Pilot Frixion Waai gel pen. This is just in the black shade, and I would like to test out both the gel pen and the smearing as well as the erasing function of this pen. Alright, so there is that. As you can see, after 1 second, then there was a little bit of smudging. I'd say that there's just the slightest bit of smearing after the 5 seconds as well, but 10 seconds looks perfectly fine to me, at least to the naked eye. And the erasing functionality of it does look pretty nice. If you look very closely, you can still see where I erased it, which is very interesting. I didn't notice that to be an issue on the 160 GSM paper, but that is something that I am noticing on this paper specifically. So that is very interesting. Alright, so now I just have a couple of highlighters that I would like to try out. This first one is, of course, a Zebra Mildliner in the copper shade, one of my absolute favorites. Alright, so for the Mildliner, as you can see, then immediately after, then there was smudging for both sides. However, for the 5 and 10 seconds, then they look perfectly fine to me. There wasn't any smudging from what I can tell, so that is definitely great to see. The second highlighter that I would like to test out is one of these Stabilo BOSS highlighters. This was part of like the natural collection, I believe, so it's just kind of this soft green shade. Alright, so for the Stabilo BOSS, then there was definitely smudging immediately after. I do see just a little trace of smudging after 5 seconds, but 10 seconds looks perfectly fine to me, so that is great. So the next few items that I have are just a few markers. I'm going to start off with one of these Tombow twin tone markers, just in this brown shade. Let's start off with the thicker nib. Alright, so there's that one. As I kind of expected, the thicker side appeared to smudge easier than the fine side. So immediately after, there's a little bit of smudging after 5 seconds, and honestly even just the slightest bit after 10 seconds. For the finer nib, then it smeared a little bit immediately after, but for 5 seconds and 10 seconds, then it looks perfectly fine. Next, I have one of these Zebra Clickart markers. This is just in the black shade, so let's go ahead and test this one out. Alright, so for the Zebra Clickart, then as you can see, immediately after it did smear pretty terribly. 5 seconds, then there is still just the slightest bit of smearing, but fortunately after 10 seconds, then it looks perfectly clean, which is great. Next, I'm just going to try out a Crayola Super Tips. This one is just kind of like in a green olive shade. Alright, so that is very great to see. As to be expected, there was a little bit of smudging immediately after, but for 5 and 10 seconds then it looks very clean and I don't detect any smudging whatsoever. Alright, so the last pen that I would like to try out before I kind of get into some more miscellaneous things would be this Kuretake ZIG Clean Color Dot Marker. This is just in the black shade. Alright, so I went ahead and did both the fine end and the dot nib. So as you can see, there was smudging for basically all the stages. This one is a little misleading just because I feel like for 10 seconds then my finger was just slightly like sweatier than at the 5 seconds. So it does look a little bit more smudgy at 10 seconds than at 5 for the fine nib. And then as for the dot end, that it immediately smeared after 5 seconds, then there is still just a slight trace of like saturation, so it did smear. And then for 10 seconds, then there's just a slight trace of smudginess after that as well. Just something that you would want to keep in mind when you are using these dot markers, because it applies so much ink all in one concentrated area, then it will take a little bit longer to dry than if you were to just write or journal something quick. Alright, so before I finish this page, then I just have a couple of more supplies that I wanted to test out. That's not necessarily like pens by any means, but something that I do want to try would be stamping something onto the page. So for the ink that I have, then this is the Craft Smart ink pad. It's just in a black shade, and I believe I got this from either Michael's or Hobby Lobby. So just something like more affordable and like generic from one of those stores. And then I'm just going to be using some stamps from this alphabet stamp box that I have. This was something that I ended up finding on Amazon, so I'll just go ahead and test the stamps out with this ink pad. And this is more so just so that I can see how it looks on the back side, like if there's any ghosting or possibly even bleed through. So I'm not going to be doing like a timed smudge test with the ink. And then lastly for this page, then I just wanted to go ahead and test out watercolors, just because that is something that I could see myself adding to my journals in the future. So I'm just going to be taking this Pentel Aquash water brush and then my St. Petersburg White Nights watercolors, and then just add like some paint down to this bottom and see how it performs. And then once it dries, just see like if there's any ghosting or bleed through, or how well the paper holds up to it. Alright, so now that the watercolor has dried, let's go ahead and flip the page over and just take a look at any ghosting and possible bleed through. Alright, so initial thoughts. Fortunately, there is absolutely no bleed through from any of the pens, which is great. However, as to be expected, there is quite a bit of ghosting with the majority of the pens. I'd say that possibly the worst ghosting out of all of them would have to be the Zebra Clickart. It looks like it's on the verge of bleeding through, but fortunately that is not the case and did not happen. I'm very pleasantly surprised to see that the stamp did not bleed through, and the watercolor looks great. There is some wrinkling and texture because of the water, but in terms of the actual like pigmentation of the paint, then there is no sign of that, which is great. One thing that I am very surprised about is the white gel pen and just how visible that is on the other side. I feel like it's not really even that visible on the front end, but on the back end then it just looks very noticeable, so I was not expecting to see that. Well, I guess that does it for my pen test in my Sterling Ink Common Planner. In conclusion, I am very happy to see how well most of these performed, and the ones that didn't perform that well, I'm honestly not very surprised, and I'm not disappointed about it. Specifically like for the fountain pen inks and for like just those very juicy pens that I have in my collection, then that did not surprise me by any means. I wasn't expecting it to hold up incredibly on this paper, especially after immediately writing with it. That's just something that I would need to take special care with and just allow it enough time for it to fully dry before moving around the page or flipping it over. So yeah, I thought that this was very interesting to do, and it honestly gives me some peace of mind to move forward in my journal with using and experimenting with different pens and different media. I hope that you found this helpful as well. I did want to test out like some inks with my glass dip pen and just see how that performed on the paper as well, but I am running pretty low on battery right now, and I feel like this video is probably long enough. So if you would like to see a separate video on me doing that, then do let me know. But I hope that you found this video helpful and also enjoyable. If there are some of you out there who are also new to the Common Planner or like a Hobonichi, something with like the Tomoe river paper, then hopefully you found this helpful and it helped to narrow down any pens that you were maybe eyeing and wanting to try, but seeing how it performed, then maybe that ended up changing your mind or something like that. If you have any other video suggestions, then please do let me know, or if you have any other comments or questions about different pens on this paper, then please leave some recommendations down below. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!